Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Erin Beckwell. Some of you may have crossed paths with me in the past. I have a lot of different roles I play in the community, mostly in social work circles. So I am going to be talking about adverse childhood experiences and protective and compensatory or positive childhood experiences this afternoon. And so, yeah, I come to you from Treaty 6 territory. I'm in Saskatoon and homeland of the Métis people as well. And I work presently at the Faculty of Social Work as a field education coordinator. And also I'm currently serving as president of SASW, Saskatchewan Association of Social Workers. So yeah, tend to do lots in the social work world, but am really interested professionally and personally in trauma and adversity and how those impact folks throughout the lifespan. And do have some of my professional background was actually working with Kids First. And so doing some early child development work and working with parents and families as well, which I draw upon quite heavily when I speak about these topics. So I am actually going to screen share. And so Lee's going to put a link in the chat where you can find the slide deck. I also have folders set up where you can find some additional resources that might be helpful to you in navigating some of this content or integrating a sort of understanding of ACEs and PACEs into your work. So I encourage you to check those out during the session or after the session today. So I'm just going to go back to territorial acknowledgement. So I mentioned I'm on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis people, and there we go. I just want to acknowledge that, can you guys hear me? I keep getting notices that I'm muted. So I just want to make sure folks are hearing me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thanks, Lee. So I just want to acknowledge though that of course when we talk about trauma, and I'll speak to some of this in the next slide, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are a variety of trauma stories in our communities. And particular to Indigenous peoples and communities, there is a layered experience of trauma there that includes what we often talk about as intergenerational trauma, but that historical context matters a lot because even for folks who don't have those direct lived experience or living experience of things that we would call adversity or trauma, there's that echo and that impact that is felt. And we have now actually got the science. This is not new knowledge, but now we have it in a form that is considered acceptable and valid in our colonial world that says people are still affected, even if they don't have that direct experience. And we can know that in our minds, but actually integrating and understanding of that in our practice can look very different, and integrating that in our organizations can look quite different. And so I think it's just so critical to start from that place of acknowledging that we all likely have a trauma story, and there are individuals and communities whose trauma story isn't just their own. It goes through their entire community and back through generations as well, which certainly does shift the context and experience and impact of these things in people's lives. So the other thing I will say is, of course, we're going to talk about adversity today. I won't go into talking about specific details of people's experience. However, I don't know what brings up stuff for folks and what might be experiences triggering or distressing or uncomfortable. So just remember you have choice and control throughout this session in terms of how you engage and when you engage. And so I asked you to just, pause for a moment and reflect on how you're doing, and do that ongoing, especially if you notice yourself not feeling super comfortable, or you start to notice some distressing feelings. Ask yourself what you need. But also if you notice, sort of distressing feelings coming, or you start to recognize something as a trigger, one of the quickest grounding strategies you can do is just get your feet on the floor or on the ground. I tend to sit in my chair at work with my feet up on the wheels. And so often when I notice myself, maybe my heart will start to pound a bit, or I'm feeling just uncomfortable and tense, I have to remind myself, Erin, get your feet on the ground. And that shift, that movement can be very helpful in terms of grounding, but also just being mindful about breathing deep into your belly if you can, or as deep as you can and feel comfortable doing, and being mindful of your breath if that feels safe. And remembering that you have capacity to cope. It's brought you here, it's this far. And so what are your internal resources, but also acknowledging when you might need to reach out and access some resources externally. And then I think the last thing is just lots of us are super used to being on video platforms a lot these days and have for a while. But remembering this also brings with it sometimes coming to these conversations from different spaces and how that might impact our ability to engage with the content. And so you're in a space that's public or not, at least not private, or that doesn't feel comfortable, maybe physically, emotionally, just acknowledge that that might impact how you engage today. And if you don't feel safe and comfortable right now, is there anything you can do to shift that before we go or as we go? Are there certain sounds, sensations in general, including things like texture and visual, and are there ways you can adjust that? So everyone's cameras are off. One of my examples I often use for that is, turning your self view off, but that may be a piece for you. Is your cameras are set as off, but if you're still seeing a reflection of yourself, sometimes that can be triggering or contribute to discomfort and stress during these interactions. So you can actually turn off that view if that helps you. So I'm going to dive right in. And so this, as Lee sort of alluded to, this session is going to talk about adverse childhood experiences and positive or protective and compensatory childhood experiences, so ACEs and PACEs. Sometimes folks use PCEs instead of PACEs. And so I think it's important though, just to know, like, I have a solid hour of content planned and time for questions. If you have questions or things you would like to hear more about as we go, please feel free to throw those in the chat. I have the chat open and can see it as I go. So I like to be able to sort of course correct and integrate your questions and feedback. Also, if you have examples from your own practice or lived experience, please feel free to share those either through a direct message to me, and I can share or integrate that information into the presentation as I go as well without identifying you if you send directly. And then I think the other piece is, if you'd rather than typing in the chat, if you'd rather unmute, you may have to raise your hand and we will unmute you if we've got everyone muted. I'm not sure how that's set up in this one. So sometimes we need to unmute you. You can't do that yourself. So feel free though, raise your hand. And so that's should be in the lower part of your Zoom toolbar in the reactions little tab. So we also will have plenty of time, hopefully at the end, for some conversation. And so as I start talking about ACEs, many of you have likely heard about this, but there's something called the ACE study. This is sort of the, I guess, the ancestor of this work. And so I would say it goes back even further, that there has been knowledge and understanding of the impact of adversity and stress, especially in children, as long as humans have sort of been roaming the earth. And often when we look at especially Indigenous communities and cultures, there's teachings and very strong pieces of culture that focus on nurturing children and families, often specifically mothers and children, and that is maybe not articulated as a way to protect against adversity or prevent adversity, but now that's the language we've applied. And of course that language comes from sort of colonial science finally validating these ideas that have been around for generations and generations, right? And so I think that's an important piece. This study that was done in the United States. There are limits for this study. Lots of studies, most studies have limitations. This one has some particular limitations. It also has some strengths. And so it was a fairly large study. It was over 15,000 people. they were attending a very specific clinic for a very specific purpose. So they were going in for a physical. There has been some questioning about the representativeness of this group of folks, this sample from the study, and that of course, folks who in the United States would be accessing this particular clinic would have had health insurance. And so that, brings with it particular privilege. And that does dictate in many ways who is represented in these study findings. So that is the biggest sort of limitation of this research. But this study actually looked at folks for a period of years, and it followed a few for 15 years and longer, which is quite something. It asked 10 questions, and this was sort of in addition to the general history that was taken of folks when they came in to get their physical. They were asked before the age of 18, have you ever experienced any of these 10 things? Yes or no was basically the question. And so those 10 things I'll talk about in a moment, but they're listed in the middle of this slide. And so one of the strengths of this study, it was one of the first times that researchers had considered the combined effect of multiple types of trauma and adversity, rather than just looking at, what if you experienced physical abuse? What if you experienced having a caregiver who was had a mental health issue? And they were looking at the combined effect, which really is where this research sort of shines. And so these are the original 10 ACEs. And so these are the 10 that were in that original study back in the 90s. And so they looked at physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect. And most of us in our training, that's what we learn about if we learn anything about trauma, is we might see it attached to those types of experiences. What this study also did, though, is they had a category called household dysfunction. I generally tend not to use language of dysfunction. This is their language. So they talked about, did you have a parent or caregiver before age 18 who had mental illness? And again, not a lot of detail in this. These were yes, no questions. Did you have an incarcerated relative or family member? Was your mother treated violently? Did you have a parent or caregiver who engaged in substance use? Or did you have parents or caregivers who divorced or separated? And so, of course, people have asked over the years a lot of questions about these. Well, what does a yes or no answer to these questions tell us? It doesn't go into the intensity, the duration, or other contextual details of people's experience that we know are important. We also know not all of these experiences actually result in adversity or are experienced as negative. So the example often held up is separation and divorce, that for some families, experiences of separation and divorce actually can reduce the amount of adversity in that family, or be experienced as maybe positive even. And so that's important to acknowledge. But they picked these 10 things based off of what the scientific literature had already studied and documented as the most prevalent or common types of adversity. And so I'd ask you, and I'll flip back to the slide previous, just to take a moment, if you feel okay to do so, you don't have to, and you do not have to share this number with anyone, just to think about how many ACEs you have. So I'll go back to the screen, and you can also reflect on whether you've been asked this type of question before and what that was like for you, what the context was. Was it in a workshop like this? Was it in a service delivery setting? But also reflecting on your understanding of these parts of practice. And so if you're a service provider, how does that influence your practice, whether that's your own experience of ACEs or those of the folks you support? So basically the way it works, and often now you will hear people talk about ACE scores, and I'll talk about scoring and screening in a bit. But one of the pieces that came out of this research that was quite tangible was the ACE score. And so this idea that everybody has a score out of 10 that basically tells us how many ACEs we had in our childhood. And so the idea is if you have an ACE score that's fairly low, you should have fewer long-term effects, negative effects. And if your ACE score is high, you may have lots of negative effects. But again, that's on a population basis, not necessarily individually. And so I think that's important to remember as well, is that these studies were looking at populations. They were not necessarily distilling this down to the applicability of this to an individual. And so when we start talking about the practice implications, that's an important thing to remember. So the other thing that's happened, of course, people have said, well, what about a whole bunch of other things that we know can have a negative effect on people's development and their health throughout the lifespan? And so there's now the expanded ACEs, and there's different language depending on who's talking about them. And the ones most studied are in the circle. So you can see in the middle, the conventional or original 10 ACEs, and these focus on abuse, neglect, household dysfunction. The expanded ACEs around the outside look at things like being attached to particular systems like foster care, experiences of bullying, community violence and neighborhood safety. Those have been studied quite a bit, and racism. And so really starting to sort of in many ways pull away and step back a bit and look at some of the more systemic and structural experiences that may contribute to poorer health throughout the lifespan. And then in the orange box, you'll see a list of experiences that are less well researched and documented, but are known to have a negative effect on health. We just don't know as much about how long that effect is and where it might impact health. But any experience of death, particularly if that death is sudden, what we'd call an out-of-time death, which is death of a child, somebody who's considered too young, who hasn't lived a full life. So where the timeline of their life doesn't align with what we think of as expected or natural in some way, or violent death. So anytime there's violence attached, it sort of falls into that category of adversity. Persistent health issues and disability. And often here's where we see an overlap with experiences with the health system sometimes being a source of trauma and adversity. And so any child and groups of children who spent time engaged in health experiences or having to navigate and sometimes being expected to overcome health issues or disability, or rendered invisible because of the nature of their disability or health issue, those of course can result in adversity as well. Being homeless or houseless or unstably housed is the other piece that comes with this. Any experience of oppression, which includes homophobia, transphobia, ableism, sizeism, you name it, can trigger that experience of adversity. Witnessing violence or death outside the home or inside the home, and experiences of war, famine, natural disasters. And there's likely more, right? And so one of the things that when we start focusing on adversity, it can start to feel like there's so much of it. And that is partly why we saw a real sort of surge in research and conversation about, well, what about positive things? And how do we reduce the impact? So this is an image that's emerged recently and really shifted the conversation about ACEs. I quite like it. It is from ACEs Connection, and the link is at the bottom. They have a whole document that's actually included in the folder of resources that talks about the 3 realms of ACEs. So traditionally, we looked at household or individual family, so very micro level adversity. And that original study did that. And much of the research that flowed after the original study also focused on experiences of individuals or individual families. And so looked at things often as individual issues and didn't acknowledge some of the structural or community pieces that surrounded it. So we saw a bit of a shift when we started looking at things like experiences of discrimination, especially racism, and general experiences of violence and safety. Those started the shift to thinking about community factors. And so in this illustration, you know, those roots that often then we see on the surface, some of the more individual level or house family level sort of considerations and experiences. And then the latest, which I quite appreciate, is the addition of the environment, which can think about, that can be our physical environment, natural disasters, wildfires, which has impacted us in Western Canada in a very significant way in the last, 5 to 10 years, and seem to have become an ongoing concern are heat and drought issues, flooding, storms, and all of these are attached to, of course, changes in our environment. But then we also include in here experiences like the pandemic. And so there has been, I think all along during the pandemic, a fair bit of conversation about how will this affect children in particular moving forward? What is the impact and how do we try to reduce the negative effects? And often though, what we do is we go straight to, we need to make sure that children continue to progress in their education. It's important, absolutely. However, there's also pieces around things like mental health, coping strategies, social connection, and so on. But bigger than that, when we look at the family as a unit, the community even bigger than that, and looking at how all of us are faring, that we cannot separate out the well-being of children from the well-being of caregivers and parents, the well-being of communities. And so being able to think about how all of these pieces fit together. And so we know there's been an uptick in substance use, increases in intimate partner or familial violence, and those types of experiences, of course, also then create conditions of adversity for children. So the impact of ACEs, and this was the part, thanks, Marcel. I just saw the question about culture. And so culture actually will come out more, it shows up more in the positive or protective experiences. But I think it's actually interesting to look at culture in terms of especially colonial culture, the negative effects of that, right? Individualism, that, sense that we're all just sort of taking care of ourselves and that's our main concern, or that, we try to sort of stay very separate from others in a lot of ways, especially in urban settings. But yeah, I think there's both ACEs and PACEs that are linked to culture in different ways, for sure. And so the impact of ACEs is often one of the sort of moments where people go, wow, that's pretty wild. And so this slide shows where that initial study found there were differences for people who had higher ACE scores versus lower or no ACE score. And so folks who have ACE scores of, usually they say 7 or higher are considered sort of high risk. And I try to avoid language of assigning labels of risk to people because it does, again, individualize the experience. Well, this person is high risk, when we often have an awareness that the risk is actually created through a combination of factors, not all, and in fact, often most, not within the control of the individual. And so trying not to sort of talk about high risk individuals, and again, also because this work wasn't done to sort of label or assess individuals necessarily. So what they found though was the higher your ACE score, the lower your rate of physical activity. They are less likely to be getting the recommended amount of physical activity every week. And I mean, there's lots of us who probably struggle in that department, but that there's a relationship there that even when you control for other factors, those that they had data available on, they found that it stayed. There was still a higher or a lower rate of physical activity. They found higher rates of smoking in folks, higher rates of problematic substance use, whether that was alcohol or other substances, and more frequent absences from school and work, which of course we know that those absences likely contribute to other adversity in some ways, whether that's through lower income or education levels and so on. And then in the physical and mental health, these were all increased rates. So we saw the researchers saw increased rates of weight and body image issues, including eating disorders, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, sexually transmitted infections, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, so lung disease, and broken bones. And again, often people's initial reaction to hearing about these seem to be, well, yeah, when people have a stressful childhood, they develop poor coping skills, maybe because their parents didn't teach them how to cope better. And then those poor coping skills translate to poor health. Yes, to some extent, that model does still is a factor, but it's not the whole story. And so even when they controlled for behavioral things like how many cigarettes you smoked a day, there was still an increased risk of developing lung cancer. And so people who'd had adversity in childhood and never smoked had higher rates of cancer of all kinds, actually, than people who had no or less adversity. So that's where these things become important. And so one of the things that's really interesting is this came from physicians. And so there was a sense that, well, once physicians know this, that's going to change the way we do health, the way our health system works. And it hasn't. And this knowledge has, generally speaking, not been integrated into how the health system works, whether it's physicians or others providing care or programming. And that is a significant challenge, is how do we get services of all kinds, but particularly in the area of health, where we may be seeing folks in sort of later childhood, youth, and adulthood with some of these what are now labeled as health problems. Are we understanding that one of the triggers for the development of these things could have happened many years before, could have been beyond this individual's control, and that there's a phenomenon here. And very often there's no awareness or understanding of that at all. So this is essentially what the ACE knowledge tells us, is that lots of people in our population have that adversity in childhood. And so I would bet, and sometimes in these settings, I do surveys, live polling, where people enter their ACE score, and we see in our group how many people have high ACEs. Just a question, if you were to guess whether this group of folks, who I will assume all work with children, families associated with early years somewhere, do you think our ACE scores would be higher than average, lower than average, or about average? And if you want to type in the chat, you can. But just something to think about. What's your sense of you and your colleagues relative to what you would guess an average ACE score might be? There's interesting, not a lot of literature about it, but there's a little bit, and it's very interesting that in professions like higher, yeah, thank you, Marcella, higher, that in the helping professions, specifically they've researched social work, we have higher than average ACE scores across the board. Nursing is the other one that tends to, psychology, and also education or teaching. And there's a lot of reasons that could be, and not a lot of, sort of what's considered valid research or reliable research that tells us why, but people have a lot of ideas about why, and I think many of them are likely, if we do the research, going to be confirmed, that many people who come to these professions are partly drawn to this work because of our own experiences of adversity. And we either want to give back in some way, we want to help make it better for someone so they don't have to suffer as we did or struggle like we did. There's often a personal story attached to people who are drawn to helping type work. And so there's lots of us who have adverse experiences, absolutely. Lots of humans, that's part of our story. That doesn't mean we all end up having really poor health because of it, but the sort of more intense your experience, the more prolonged your experience, and the greater number of those adverse experiences you've had, the more likely you will become one of the folks who end up with what we call disrupted neurodevelopment, which basically means these experiences impact the way our brain develops, which impact the way we process the world, how safe we feel, how able we are to access our executive functioning, which controls things like impulse control, decision-making, reason, and logic, which can, of course, the older we get, become more and more challenging to live with and for others to understand and accommodate. So of those folks who end up with what's in the literature called disrupted neurodevelopment, so their brain is affected by the adversity that surrounds them, which is often a stress response, there's a subset who will have, an impact on their social, emotional, or cognitive well-being. And that can be there's a very broad spectrum of those. Of those, though, a subset will adopt what are often labeled as risk behaviors. And again, we don't do a great job of actually situating what we label as risk behavior, unhealthy behavior, in a context that acknowledges the impact of things like adversity. And then of those folks who are engaging in those risky behaviors, we see a subset develop, what we often see as disorder, disease, disability, social problems, and so on. And then a subset of those will have a shortened lifespan, early death because of this. And so some studies, and most of the studies about this come out of the United States. There are a few from Europe and a few from Canada, but there's been a real movement in the United States in the last 10 to 15 years looking at these things and ultimately forcing people to measure them, which is also interesting and sometimes good and sometimes quite problematic. They have found that people with the highest ACE scores, so above 7, can have as much as a 20-year shorter life than people who have an ACE score below 3. So that gap is significant. 20 years of life, that is a big deal. And so there have been campaigns and again, campaigns that have strengths and certainly some drawbacks that talk about how adversity kills. Or adversity is literally robbing people of years of life, which I think is significant and important, isn't always messaged well or in a way that actually addresses or helps people feel they can do anything about this. So that brings us to looking at PACEs. And so these were originally framed as CounterAces, and the language has sort of evolved and now looks at positive, protective is the other P word that's used here, and compensatory, so things that make up for adversity. And so those PACEs, they also are sometimes just called PCEs, positive childhood experiences. And so as the ACE study and its implications became more well known, and people started talking about it more, one of the reasons for that was a TED Talk by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who's a physician from the United States in California. She's now, well, has been until very recently, Surgeon General of the state of California. And her priority as Surgeon General was addressing ACEs and supporting children and families. And she did a TED Talk, probably pushing, it's longer than 5 years, maybe 10 now, where she talked about the ACE study and the impact of ACEs and how they had applied this work in the clinic that she had founded. And it was really sort of engaging, and people got quite excited about this work. Granted, this was over 20 years after the original study was released. And so it took a long time for this work to sort of land in a way that people could take it up and do something with it. So Dr. Burke-Harris really did that with her TED Talk and subsequent work. She's also got a book called The Deepest Well that if you'd like to read more about adverse childhood experiences, I encourage you to pick up her book. She's a very fascinating woman, and I don't always 100% agree with her perspectives on these issues, but she's certainly done a lot to raise the profile of the impact of adversity on children and families. And so folks started asking questions like, well, how do we reduce the impact of ACEs? What do we do about this? Why are some people impacted seemingly, in more profound ways than others? How do we shift from deficit-based thinking or oriented thinking to more strengths-based or empowerment-oriented thinking? How do positive experiences impact us? If we know a bit about negative ones or adverse experiences, which are the most important positive ones that we need to try to make sure all children get, because that may reduce the impact and in some cases perhaps even negate the impact of adversity. So what can we do, especially when we come to our work from a place that is not preventative? And very often our work isn't there to prevent what happens, it responds to things that have already happened. People have been flagged as at risk or in need of support in some way. And that often means adversity has already been part of that family or individual story. And so how do we support them in ways that are helpful, in ways that benefit throughout the lifespan, even if we can't stop or undo what's already happened, which can be a really tough piece. So that moves us into some of the research around PACEs. And so this is from a group in the United States, again, that has a project called HOPE. And they have 4 building blocks that they've identified. There's a handout about Project HOPE in the Dropbox folder, so you're welcome to go check that out if you would like. And so their 4 building blocks are relationships, environments, engagement, and social and emotional development. So they really want everything in a program or a service or in our individual practice to be focused first on the relationship, that that is going to reduce the impact if people have quality, safe relationships that are consistent and predictable. That if they have safe environments, which is their home environment, whatever that is at the moment, and the environment at school, in community, needs to be addressed as well. Engagement and connection, so that's again an extension of relationship, but connection to support and a network of support, and being able to have meaningful engagement. So that doesn't mean, oh, well, I have a worker here. That doesn't necessarily mean they're engaged, right? So how do we actually focus on meaningful, intentional engagement? And for those that we feel maybe we aren't really meaningfully connected, how do we go back to the relationship and sort of work from there? And then how do we help foster positive social and emotional development? And that doesn't just mean, you know, going through ages and stages stuff all the time. In fact, ages and stages type models may not always be culturally responsive. They may also sometimes not go well if folks have had that experience of adversity, because they can be experienced as sort of individualizing or personalizing systemic or structural problems. And people can see that as documentation of their failure as parents or caregivers, is if we're looking at milestones, right, only. They can be very useful to talk about developmental milestones or ages and stages in some contexts, but we need to be mindful that we're speaking holistically, accessibly, but also in a strengths-based and person-oriented way about social and emotional development. So this is sort of my way of talking about ACEs and PACEs, and you are welcome to use any of my slides however you'd like. So if you want to, you know, put this on your bulletin board in your staff area, or use this with folks, that's totally fine. If it makes sense to you, take it and use it. That's what it's there for. And so cup fillers, these are the PACEs, right? This is the stuff that helps keep children's coping capacity higher. And really that's what we're looking at, is one of the greatest predictors of whether an experience is going to have a negative effect throughout the lifespan is coping capacity. And this is for at any point in lifespan, but becomes particularly important in childhood, where there's so much sort of critical and sensitive development stuff happening. So people need to feel, children need to feel safe and protected by an adult at home. It doesn't mean everybody, it means one person. But also having teachers or adults who care, who aren't your parents, and at least 2 who genuinely, and you feel an authentic sense of caring and connection is important. Being able to talk with your family about feelings, and that includes, you know, the full range of not just what was good about your day, but in creating space for children to explore what we often talk about as negative emotions. Although I generally encourage folks to find other language that doesn't assign positive and negative, because it certainly leads us all to this idea that things are either, because usually positive means good and negative means bad. And we don't really want kids to think being angry is bad, or being sad is bad. These things are emotions, just like being happy or excited. And so being able to sort of have as well-rounded a conversation about emotions, and then create space for children to talk about that or express that. Liking school, which is not the same as attending school or doing well at school. And so that is one that's really critical, is how do we keep, if kids like school, how do we keep them liking it as long as we can? And that may mean some advocacy with the school or with parents, trying to figure out what are the things this child likes. Do they like the social aspects of it? Do they like certain classes? Do they like certain teachers? Do they like a break from home? What are the things they like about school, and how can we bolster those things, which may mean shifting our focus a little bit, at least at first, in terms of addressing things like attendance or performance at school. And for high school age youth, it's a feeling of belonging. And so again, different than attendance and performance, the sense that you fit somewhere in the school community. And so we know that if children don't feel that, the older they get, the more they move into that adolescent period, the more they start to struggle if they don't feel they belong. And often that means there's, experiences of isolation and perhaps even bullying. Opportunities to have fun and experience joy. These are particularly important if a child or a family is really experiencing some fairly intense adversity on multiple fronts. How do we create space for these children to have joy in their lives? Which, especially when families are in survival mode, can be really hard. Most of the folks that I've worked with as adults, this has been part of their sort of healing from trauma and adversity, is how do I have fun and feel safe having fun, but also feel like I have a right to have fun and joy in my life, even when I'm struggling. And so protecting that, but also promoting that for parents, because it's great for all of our mental health to have joy in our day. Predictability in routine, and that doesn't mean rigid routine or like super structured, but it means predictable and consistent. And so that can be very basic. When I get home, I know my mom will be there. Right? That's predictable routine. It might not be an imposed structure on a child's life, but if they have a sense that things happen in a consistent, predictable way, that helps them settle and keeps their nervous system better regulated. Feeling comfortable with yourself, which includes feeling comfortable in your own body. And so particularly for children and youth who are in bodies that maybe don't fit the very narrow norm we've all been sold about what we're supposed to look like, right? So people with disabilities, kids in larger bodies, smaller bodies, short, tall, the whole shebang. And so figuring out how do we create a space where this child learns they are enough just as they are right now. They don't have to change in order to fit or belong or be safe. And beliefs that provide comfort, enjoyment, and participating in community traditions. And this can be cultural. This can be religious or spiritual. This can also be, though, more relational and social. So can be things like, well, we go to the powwows in the summer, and that's a community tradition and a family tradition that brings comfort and enjoyment. There may also be, though, like attending church every Sunday, or volunteering as part of a community group, attending the annual community barbecue. Those are all things that children can learn, help them feel connected, belonging, and safe in their communities. And felt experience, this is the other important piece, that family is supportive when things are difficult. So this isn't just people saying the right words, it's a felt, like a visceral experience. And so a sensation that children have. And so it's important, that may involve like a sense of presence, that a family member or parent is present and listening and attending to what the child is saying or experiencing, which can be really challenging if a parent has their own challenges or is struggling around just basic needs and survival. They may be saying the right things, but are they attuned to that child? Are they connecting in a way that child feels supported? And then being supported by friends as well. And then the cup spiller side, or the ACEs, this is the stuff that's going to drain out that coping capacity. All of those original 10 ACEs, as well as the expanded ACEs, fit on this side. And so they're all things that are leaching out that coping capacity and that sense of safety and belonging often. And so being able to sort of focus on, if a child or family has a lot of cup spillers, we have to put energy into filling that cup up. that individual, but also the family collectively. And so that may mean focusing more on parents sometimes, focusing more on kids at others. And of course, there's pieces that aren't represented in both of these, but this is really drawing upon the research evidence that we have available at the moment. So here's another sort of learning from some of the PCEs research, that children who have a higher number of CounterAces, so this was using the CounterAce language, are more likely to become an adult who's comfortable seeking help and care when they need it. So that helps people have better health, right? If we can engage in help-seeking behavior, we're more likely to get the support we need when we need it. And in this study, they specifically looked at mental health and substance use support as adults. And they found that if we can bolster that sort of cup filler side, we can actually influence how likely this person is to be able to reach out and say, I need help when things get tough as an adult. And things do get tough when we're adults, it happens. And so it isn't necessarily about, sort of cherry picking particular children and families, but it is something I think we need to be mindful, especially when we know there's significant adversity surrounding or within a family. Which brings me to, how do we do this in practice? What do we need to think about and what do we need to do? So one of the first things that tends to come up is ACE screening. There's a whole sector now that's been created and emerged around ACE screening. And there's been a lot of movement around what is something tangible and concrete we can do to address this. Now that we know this, we have a responsibility, an ethical obligation perhaps, to address this. And so one intervention that has come out is we should screen everybody, some people, some children, some parents, it depends who you ask. And so this research is really, generally speaking, in its infancy. One of the most sort of well-researched screening tools is the ACE-Q, which comes out of Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's team at the Center for Youth Wellness in California. And so the ACE-Q, there's a link on this slide that you can follow to check it out. There are 3 versions. The ACE-Q Child, which is completed by a parent or caregiver, the ACE-Q Youth or Teen, they call it, which is completed by the parent or caregiver, and then the ACE-Q Teen Self-Report, which is completed by the youth themselves. And so you can use a combination of those, or you can use just one, depends on the situation. And the ACE-Q is currently available quite widely in Spanish and English. I haven't found a French translation or any Indigenous language or other language translations. They're probably out there, I just am not aware of them. And so this is a screenshot of the ACE-Q Child, where the parent essentially answers 2 questions. And the first one is at any point since your child was born, and it's based on the original 10 plus some additional considerations that look at survival needs, social determinants of health, and belonging, which have now, I think the research is pretty well established that those are essential. So they're looking for a number, this little box in the corner, that'll be your score. And then of the statements in that first section, how many, or in this next section, how many apply to your child? And so this looks often at some more relational, social, and structural factors, like your child was in foster care, they were separated from their primary caregiver due to immigration or deportation, the child had a serious medical procedure or life-threatening illness, those types of considerations. So it's tried to sort of evolve over time to integrate what we know now, or what's been validated in our colonial science now. And so if you as a practitioner or a program are considering screening, there's some really important things. So the essentials are, who do we serve? Who do we want to serve? And what do we understand or know about their needs, their history, and their experiences accessing care and support? Is this going to benefit? And is it going to potentially cause harm, or the likelihood of harm might increase? And so, of course, when we use an ACE questionnaire at intake, when somebody signs up or applies for a program, we need to be really clear about why we're asking that, people's right to not answer if they choose, how that information is going to be used and stored, and whether that information is attached to them individually or whether we're collecting it for more population level understanding, which would be like, 50% of the families we serve have ACE scores of 5 or higher in at least 2 members. That would be a population level, whereas individually it would be, well, I noticed on your intake form you had a score in section 1 of 6, which puts you in a moderate ACE score. Let's talk about that and what we can do to adjust that down for the benefit and well-being of your children and for you. And so how that's done, of course, needs to be handled very carefully to maximize benefit, but also reduce risk of harm. So we also need to look at what is our role and our capacity if we get those positive ACE screens, which is what we say, the language that's used when folks have any score in those tools, right? So when they're telling us they've had any adversity or their child is experiencing adversity currently. And so what are we able to do? Do we have the knowledge, the training, perhaps, the time? Are we expected or permitted even by our organization or program to intervene or respond to disclosures of trauma like this? And what do we do? And so there are some folks who feel if we ask these questions, we have an ethical obligation to be able to link people with support to address them. And in many communities, including our largest urban centers in Saskatchewan, we don't have the services needed that are specialized and appropriate to do this, which is a huge issue and should make us all pause if we're thinking about asking these questions, right? If somebody says, yeah, I've got all this stuff going on, and then we say, okay, thanks for sharing, moving on with our child development program, right? That can feel like an erasure, a dismissal of people's experience, and it may have taken them a lot to disclose that. So being able to be aware of that is really, really critical. But also being aware of our own capacity, right? Do we have the capacity, if we start asking about this, to even acknowledge it and address it individually if we're not referring out? So looking at our program or agency's role, our mandate, our service delivery system, our capacity, are we maxed out with waiting lists? And, are we having to be much more stringent about who's eligible for programs and supports? Then this might not be a time to introduce an additional piece that's going to result in more work. There will be more work if we start asking these questions, right? Then the question is it ethical for us not to ask? We know these things are happening in our communities. So should we not be asking about them? And there's certainly benefit and harm either way, and lots in between and lots of layers. And this is really going to have to be a decision that is made with great reflection and thought at the organization by organization or program by program level. The other piece that has been shown in the research as being essential is ongoing training for all staff who have anything to do with this, including folks like reception, who might be handing someone the clipboard with this on it, or the people who are entering data into computers, or the people who are, then having a one-on-one conversation, or maybe you're doing this as a conversation. How do we train and support folks on an ongoing basis, not as a one-off, and not only certain staff get the training, which is an ongoing issue in lots of organizations, right? Where people who are considered frontline direct service providers may get trained, but we wouldn't train others who may be involved and maybe need that training as much, sometimes if more so, than folks who don't. And we typically tend to train on the front end and then not go back and talk about it again, or if you have questions, let us know. So only after addressing all of those considerations and coming to a place where we feel like, yeah, we're going ahead with screening, we need to look at logistics, right? Who's going to screen, when, where, how? Is this going to be part of your intake form, which means adding another page, which might be moving you into the 3 or 4 page. Is that too much for someone who maybe hasn't actually had a conversation with anyone in your organization yet? Or are you sending out intake packages in advance, and people are filling these out on their own without support, right? Is this on a clipboard that your receptionist is handing to someone? Is there an online survey? You're sending someone a link and they're clicking buttons on their computer or device. What would that be like? And then how will this information inform the way we work with folks, what we do, how we understand our processes and practices? So there's a really good tool from the Center for Healthcare Strategies, again, American, but really good at going through a lot of these considerations around screening and providing some examples of how different organizations have done this. So then when we move beyond screening, we can look at other ways of addressing ACEs and PACEs. And so one of the things that's important is that, again, we don't get stuck on, we can only intervene at the individual level. There certainly are individual things we can do. We can do some education. This is great in groups where we talk about what are ACEs, what are PACEs. I usually would say split them into two separate conversations. But great in a parenting group or in other types of group settings. And also, though, can be useful as an individual. And so when I was working with individual families with Kids First, that was part of what I talked about, depending on what was coming up in some of those initial conversations as we were building relationship. And somebody would say, well, you know, I've only been in this place for a couple weeks, and I know I don't really have, because I would go to folks' homes, I don't really have a lot of furniture yet. And they would often be sort of defending already that the assumption was I was judging where they lived, how they lived, and all of those pieces. Often what was under that, I think, was a fear that I was ticking off a list of concerns for child protection. Which, of course, that was in the back of my mind, but that was not my primary purpose in being there. So if people started talking about things like, well, we've had to move a lot because it's hard to find housing, or I needed to be closer to my kid's school, this is a door cracking open to maybe talk about how parents have experienced adversity in their own lives, especially in their childhood, and what their story is, and how is what's happening right now for a family related to that story. And it may be that parents are afraid that they are creating another generation that's having, you know, this really challenging experience, and they feel a sense of failure, shame, guilt about that. We can then sort of work with parents and caregivers on what's going well. Do you have dance parties in your living room every afternoon? That's amazing. Keep doing that. That is going to help your kids in ways that it isn't just, you know, they got to have some dancing in the living room with their mom. There's way more to it than that, and it is hugely beneficial. So learning about PACEs provides hope for folks, often in situations where there isn't a lot. It also can give workers hope, especially if we're working ongoing with folks who experience a lot of adversity. Being able to also bring in conversations about, you know, strengths, positivity, can be a very good sort of counterpoint to that and help with our own sustainability and mental health. But being able to sort of improve health and well-being by learning about, okay, maybe that's why I have this challenge, or partly why I struggle with this as an adult, can be very liberating for parents, that it's not your fault, right? And there's things you can do to help your children and help yourself. And then looking at organizations. So all of us are usually attached to a bigger program or system. So how do we help our colleagues, our teams, our leaders really integrate this type of information into how they deliver services, how the organization is structured? I often talk about trauma-informed and healing-centered organizations. And that means, how do we create better work environments for the people who are providing services? And how do we make sure our programs are not inadvertently contributing to adversity or judging adversity or even dismissing it, and promoting those protective and compensatory, or those positive childhood experiences? And then we can look community and system as well. And in the community, it's how do we help communities understand? So there's some education there, but how do we nurture and foster development of innovative ideas about how communities can support families and communities, right? How do we make it a community where people feel they have folks to lean on, but where they feel safe or as safe as possible? And so again, how do we create those mindful, healing-centered approaches that maybe reduce the impact of adversity and encourage connection and healing? And then at the system level is where the policies come in, is how do we find common connections across sectors, which is often a challenge, right? The education sector and the health sector maybe don't talk so often, or like to sort of divide up, well, that's your job and this is mine. This can be a bridge between sectors, no matter which ones those are, and they can really help even across professions or disciplines for us to find a common ground. That is, I think, just starting to happen more frequently, but then also looking at how can we promote policy. And this is another area that the United States has actually in some ways done quite well at the state level in some settings, promoting an understanding of adversity within policy, but also how do we contribute to and support those PCEs or PACEs and the interplay between the two. So here's some more concrete pieces. I'm going to go through fairly quickly so we can open it up to conversation and questions. That it's important to name adversity. Sometimes I think our leaning is let's focus on what's going well. People often need to have adversity acknowledged. People may feel very alone in their struggle with adversity. They may feel shame and guilt about adversity, especially as parents and caregivers. And it can be so important to name that adversity, especially if it's social, systemic, or structural adversity. To be able to give folks some language around that can be very empowering. And so it doesn't mean we only talk about the positive. People may need to be validated in their struggle with a very difficult, negative part of life. And that doesn't mean we sit there and we focus only on what's not going well, but being able to talk about adversity is important, and acknowledging the complexity of that adversity is not an individual failing. It is manufactured and maintained by a variety of systems, services, lack of social support, history, and generally speaking, disrupting or shifting out of adversity isn't easy, and it takes years, sometimes generations to do. So reminding folks of that, reminding ourselves of that this isn't something people can just wake up one day and be like, I'm going to disrupt all the adversity in my family's life. Even if they do that, it's incredibly challenging to actually have that happen, and it takes time. It often also takes sustained, intensive support, and not all families have access to that. And then how can we take a harm reduction approach to slow and reduce the impact of adversity, which I say no matter what our role is, that should be part of our thinking. How do we reduce harm? And so we might not be able to stop adversity from happening at all, but how do we sort of step into that experience in a way that says, okay, I'm going to meet you where you're at, and let's talk about reducing the impact of this, which may be, through bolstering those PACEs. And so if we're working with parents or we're parents ourselves, integrating PACEs knowledge into our approach, especially if we're trying to be strengths-based. So how do we name what's going well or what can help? How do we link strengths in the parent, the child, the family, the community, the system with what we know about PACEs, right? So if you are working with a family who has a child who loves going to school, but they don't behave well there, and there's issues with their consistent attendance, can we use that love of school or liking of school even as a springboard for some other strategies? Or can it be enough for now? And that may be where we start, but these things don't generally happen by accident, so we need to be intentional. How can we integrate PACEs or protective and compensatory experience into how we're addressing ACEs? So not seeing them as totally separate, but being able to integrate that and say, well, I get that housing has been a struggle for you and your family, and that makes sense to me given the low rates of income assistance in our province and the steadily, constantly rising rental costs. and the challenge is navigating the rental housing market, especially if people are experiencing adversity. There's often a challenge even in getting housing if they have the money. So then how do we talk about, okay, during this time where your housing is maybe unstable, how do we nurture some positive things around it? So it might be, well, you're here for a few weeks and you know that you've got this for, a little bit to stay. You don't know what's going to happen down the road. How do we make sure that in this time of stress, because it's going to be stressful for everyone, we're nurturing some things that are going to help people be resilient? And again, not talking about, well, you just need to be resilient. Giving people some of those concrete strategies. So going back to the cup fillers list and saying, are there any of these things you do? And most people will say, yeah, I have one kid who hates school and one who doesn't mind going and is fine to go every day. How do we make sure they stay fine going? And realize that's as important as getting great grades or having perfect attendance, right? And also talking about self-compassion. For us as workers, for parents and for children, caregivers and support networks, how do we create a world where perfectionism isn't expected? And in fact, it's actually seen as an unattainable, unrealistic goal and a trauma response often. So how do we have kindness and compassion for ourselves? How do we promote that in others, especially parents and kids? And those all can be part of that experience of PACEs. So at the end of the slide deck, there's some links. There's also some of these same pieces are in the folder that you'll get the link to. And then the other piece I've added at the end is the trauma-informed piece, because that's where these dovetail really nicely. A lot of the trauma-informed practice tools and guides are going to give you some additional concrete ways to address adversity and to look at how we can promote those positive experiences. They might not use that same language, but there's often a lot of overlap and intersection between trauma and violence informed approaches and the things we know about adversity and more positive experiences as they impact our health. And so the other thing I will say, and bring on the questions and comments, is you're welcome to reach out to me as well. If you have specific questions, situations you'd like a bit of a consult on, that is absolutely something I can help you out with. And if I can't, I will help you find someone who can. And so you have my email address, but also if you're inclined, you can follow me on Instagram or message me on Instagram. And I'm happy to chat with folks through that platform as well. I'm also on LinkedIn. If you're there, you can look me up. But otherwise, any questions, examples, stories where that this has maybe resonated with your experience or not. And I'm totally open to challenge of this model and this knowledge as well. I think that's important too, is to create space where folks can question it and challenge it a bit. So I'm going to stop sharing and yeah, open it up for folks to question or comment.
If you want to question or comment in person, please just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. If you want to question in writing, you can use the chat box. The hand up is located on your bottom of your screen under reactions, where it has that kind of weird happy face and the plus sign.
Okay, I see Rashmi has their hand up.
I'm working on unmuting. Okay, go ahead, Rashmi.
Hi, and hi, Lee.
Hi.
I was really interested in this ACEs, and after finding out, doing some research about it, I saw that whatever you said, everything was true. And original research was by physicians, but nothing was done by the health system. And also only 4% of physicians, pediatricians actually did screen for ACEs. And I I was talking to my colleagues, and this thing came up, like the ethical issue, where, like, if you only screen for ACEs, the first thing is there is no standard screening tool for ACEs, actually. Like you mentioned ACE-Q, and we were looking at PEARLS, which was pediatric the early adversities and related life events, I believe. And the second thing was screening for ACEs is only going to increase the number of people having high ACEs. It's not really going to have like any impact on reducing, preventing, or mitigating the impacts. So I was just wondering, like, if you do not screen for ACEs, then how will you do anything in any level, like a systemic, individual, community? Do you just go ahead and talk about PCEs, or how do you go about that?
That is a great question. And I think you've really hit on some of the main challenges with this work is the research and the practice pieces are in their infancy. And so we don't have standardized tools. And yeah, you mentioned the PEARLS tool as well, which is another sort of newer than the ACE-Q, but it's been validated sort of. And so it's got a lot of similarities actually with the ACE-Q, but it's different enough that they have validated it as a separate tool. And so a lot of the challenges are that balance between we need more knowledge to know how prevalent are these experiences in our population we see in our practice or in our program, and if we just keep asking about what's not going well, we will just have more, yeah, as you've said. And I think then we run the risk also of there isn't a really good sort of validated tool. There aren't any validated tools for positive childhood experiences yet. And I know they're coming, there's research happening and they'll be here soon, but then we're adding yet another questionnaire on top of that. Like, yeah, we'll screen you for all these things. And is that actually making us more responsive and accessible? Sometimes the answer is it's actually taking us in the wrong direction. And so, if we're not able to screen in a balanced way, is that helping? And then the challenge becomes, if we're not screening, how do we figure out what we need to do? And one of the things is, this is why I really like a trauma-informed approach, is trauma-informed care is about, at least the way I conceptualize it, is a universal precautions approach, right? Which is, don't wait for a disclosure. Let's look at every situation and go, could trauma or adversity be part of what's happening here in this family, this child's life? And if we have a sense it is, how do we adjust our approach to reflect that sense, even if we don't have a specific question to ask or screening tool or a concrete disclosure from somebody that says, yeah, I'm struggling with this. So if we're looking at how we're just orienting to practice in general, we can incorporate a bit of that. And of course, we know the impact of that is going to be not as profound as if we knew this is what's going on. We're going to try to respond specifically to what you have going on. So it's sort of a stopgap measure that is a little bit of a workaround. The other piece is looking at what data we do have available and what can it be a bit of a proxy for adversity. So that might be going to community level or even provincial data, which again, we lose a lot of that nuance and sort of specificity to an individual situation, but it may give us a sense that, it can confirm or sometimes challenge our assumptions about the prevalence of some of these issues in our communities. And so that can be important as well, and especially until we figure out better ways to do the screening in a direct way. And so I often am encouraging service providers to sort of look at, what do you know about your people, your community, whether it's the people who access you or the people who maybe aren't, and how much do you know about your population that you serve, which may not always be reflected directly in terms of who shows up in your program or your clinic or your school. And so being able to sort of look at what do we have available, and we may know there's really high substance use rates in our communities. Okay, so then we can probably say, we should be operating as if many families, that's a part of potential adversity for those kids. And of course, if we know we have a parent with a mental health issue or substance use issue, let's not forget, that doesn't mean it's a child protection issue always, but it could certainly be an issue around child development and adversity. And I think typically our response focuses on, well, we meet that threshold of child protection, you know, concern, and that's where we act. But this is asking us to consider this a little bit differently. That before it gets to that point where we're maybe having to make a tough decision about whether to call social services, are we able to acknowledge that, not in a blaming, shaming, judging way, a parent who's struggling is going to create situations and stress for their child. And that doesn't mean they're intentionally being a bad parent. It means that's how brains and bodies work. And we can cope with that. We can respond to it if we think about it and know about it. So yeah, it's, and so Lee has shared that, Rashmi, you probably could have done this talk after doing some research on ACEs and all that fun stuff. I can't wait till the report comes out. That's awesome.
Yeah,
Love it. Yeah,
thank you.
Great. And I see a comment from Shanela in the chat that, you know, she's hoping to create a lot of positive childhood experiences and doing things you didn't get to do, and that healing. And absolutely, that's a piece that I think we also often separate out parents, caregivers, and kids in terms of the healing work that, you know, parents, you need to do your own work. Let's heal together. And that healing work will be partly preventative for the kids, but it will be generating resilience, generating a capacity to cope with the adversity that will come their way, right? And absolutely, those things are crucial. And being able to remind, sometimes I think the challenges for parents and caregivers, there's a sense that focusing on themselves might be selfish, or taking them away from the children's, you know, needs and well-being, and that those don't have to be either or, they can be both and. You know, or like prioritizing the needs of the kids means setting aside your own needs. And there are lots of things, especially around PCEs or PACEs, that can be healing for everyone, and can be fairly accessible if we think about them creatively. So especially one of the reasons I talk about the living room dance party is that used to be something I would talk about with almost every family. Can I take them a packet of seeds and some clay pots from the dollar store, and can you get your hands in the dirt? Can you connect to the land? You know, walking down the boulevard in front of your apartment in your bare feet, if it's safe with a parent. But being able to think about those sort of more sensory pieces and how that can become part of well-being and promoting that positive experience for children. Any other questions or comments? This is so great. I haven't had a lot of opportunity. I teach about this stuff in the social work program, but I haven't had much opportunity to talk about it outside of the social work classroom. So I was really excited for this opportunity to talk about it more for parents and for practitioners. And I think the one thing I've learned, especially in the last little bit here as a parent, I have a teenager, and it's all well and good to say this stuff. It's also really hard. Like, I can make it sound like it's just so easy, and it's not always easy. We all have our stuff, and especially if we're struggling to survive, it can feel like there is no space for the positive experience, and we may have to start really small and really meet people where they're at, which is why I talk about acknowledging the struggle, that sometimes people just need to be seen in what they're struggling with in order to be able to do that sort of first sort of building block of relationship, is to feel like I really see you. I'm not coming in to just talk about all the good things you should be doing or how easy it is. We need to sometimes step into the adversity with folks a little bit in order to meet them there and help them find a way to balance in a different way or move forward differently.